Christmas Day, 1865. The war was over. The Confederacy had fallen. President Lincoln himself had been dead for 8 months, his promise of freedom sealed in blood and ink. The 13th Amendment had been ratified just weeks earlier, officially abolishing slavery across every corner of the United States. Church bells rang across the South that morning, their iron voices carrying the hymns of peace and redemption through frost-touched air. But in the isolated hills of rural Georgia, on the sprawling Thornhill plantation, the law of the land had not yet reached the hearts of desperate men. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world, drop a comment below telling us where you're from. And if this story moves you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the untold stories of history that changed everything. The plantation house stood like a monument to a dying world. Its white columns were chipped and weathered, paint peeling in long strips like dead skin. The cotton fields stretched empty and brown under a grey December sky, the crop long since harvested by hands that had worked without wages, without choice for generations. Inside the manor, Samuel Thornhill sat in his study, surrounded by the ghosts of wealth that no longer existed. The mahogany furniture was still polished, but the silver had been sold. The crystal decanters held only water now. The portraits of his ancestors stared down from the walls with painted eyes that seemed to judge him for what he was about to do. Thornhill was 47 years old, though he looked 60. The war had aged him. Not through battle. He had paid for a substitute to fight in his place, but through the slow erosion of watching everything he believed in crumble. His hands shook as he unfolded the letter from his creditors in Atlanta. The numbers swam before his eyes, but their meaning was clear. Pay or lose everything. The land, the house, the name itself. Without enslaved labor, without cotton profits, without the economic foundation that had sustained his family for 3 generations, he was drowning. And drowning men do terrible things to stay afloat. On the kitchen porch of the slave quarters, now legally the workers' quarters, though nothing else had changed, a woman named Sarah held her youngest child against her chest. The boy was 3 years old, his small fingers curled into the fabric of her dress. Around her stood 9 other children, ranging in age from 4 to 13. They were not all hers by birth, but she had raised them, fed them from her own meager portions, sung them to sleep when the nights grew cold and the overseers grew cruel. In the moral economy of the quarters, she was their mother, and they were her world. Sarah had been born on this plantation 32 years ago. She had picked cotton since she could walk. She had been sold once when she was 15, torn from her own mother, and shipped 2 counties away, only to be sold back to Thornhill 5 years later when her previous owner went bankrupt. She had given birth to 7 children, 3 of whom had been sold away before they learned to write their names. She had survived beatings, starvation winters, and the particular violence reserved for enslaved women who dared to look their masters in the eye. But she had never stopped hoping. When news of Lee's surrender reached the plantation in April, whispered from field hand to house servant to the quarters after dark, something fierce and fragile had bloomed in her chest, the possibility of freedom. For 8 months, that possibility had hung in the air like smoke. Some of the enslaved people had left immediately, walking off the plantation with nothing but the clothes on their backs, heading for the nearest Union garrison or simply away, anywhere away. But Sarah had stayed. Where would she go with 10 children? How would she feed them, shelter them, keep them alive in a world that had just been turned upside down? Thornhill had promised wages, never paid, and rations, always short. He had told them to be patient, to wait while he sorted out the new arrangements. Some of the older workers had believed him, or pretended to, because belief was easier than the terrifying freedom of the unknown. But this morning, everything had changed. Just after dawn, Thornhill's overseer, a man named Briggs, whose face was scarred from a childhood accident and whose soul was scarred from years of inflicting pain, had come to the quarters. He carried a list and a length of rope. Sarah had watched from her doorway as he called out names, her children's names, and ordered them to line up in the yard. 10 children, ages 3 to 13, her children. "What are you doing?" she had demanded, stepping forward. The other women in the quarters had emerged from their cabins, their faces tight with fear. They all knew that expression on Briggs's face. They had seen it before, on auction days. "Master's orders," Briggs had said, not meeting her eyes. "Now step back." "Where are you taking them?" Sarah's voice had risen, sharp with panic. "The war's over. Slavery's done. You can't—" "I said step back." Briggs's hand had moved to the pistol at his belt, and the threat was clear. Sarah had frozen, her mind racing, her body remembering every lesson it had learned about survival. Don't fight when you can't win. Don't die when you can still protect. Don't scream when silence might buy you time. Now, an hour later, the children stood in the yard outside Thornhill's study. They were dressed in their cleanest rags, their faces washed, their hands bound loosely with rope to keep them from running. The youngest ones were crying, soft, hiccuping sobs that they tried to muffle because crying had always been dangerous. The older ones stood silent and still, their eyes distant, already retreating into the internal hiding places that enslaved children learned to construct. Inside the study, Thornhill met with 3 men who had ridden in from neighboring counties. They were planters too, or had been. Now they were businessmen, speculators, traders in the grey market that had emerged in the chaotic months since the war's end. Officially, slavery was abolished. Practically, in the remote corners of the South where federal authority was still a distant rumor, the old systems persisted in new forms. Children could be apprenticed without their parents' consent. Workers could be held for debt that was calculated in ways they could never challenge. And if someone was desperate enough, cruel enough, or simply unable to accept that the world had changed, enslaved people could still be sold, the transactions recorded in private ledgers that would never see a courthouse. 10 children, Thornhill said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Healthy, strong, well-trained. I need $800. The first trader, a fat man with tobacco-stained teeth, shook his head. Market's not what it was, Samuel. Risky business these days with the Yankees sniffing around. I'll give you $400 for the lot. 400? Thornhill's face flushed. That's robbery. These children are worth exactly what someone's willing to pay, the second trader interrupted. He was thin and sharp-faced, with eyes like flint. And we're the only ones willing to pay anything at all. The world's changed, Thornhill. You can accept that or you can keep them and starve. Your choice. Thornhill looked at the third man, a preacher from the next county, who had come in his black coat and white collar, his Bible tucked under his arm like a weapon of moral justification. The preacher nodded slowly. Brother Samuel, we must be practical. The children will be cared for, apprenticed to good Christian families who will teach them trades and— I don't need a sermon, Thornhill snapped. I need the money. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the children in the yard. For a moment something flickered across his face. Doubt perhaps, or shame. Then it hardened into resolution. 600. Final offer. The fat man and the thin man exchanged glances. 500, the fat man said. Cash today. Thornhill closed his eyes. Outside, Sarah stood at the edge of the yard, held back by 2 field hands who had been ordered to restrain her if she tried to interfere. She was screaming now, her voice raw and breaking, begging Thornhill to stop, to show mercy, to remember that these were children, human children, that the war was over, that God was watching, that history would remember. But her voice was just one more sound in the cacophony of a world being torn apart and rebuilt, in the image of those who held the power to decide who counted as human and who did not. Done, Thornhill said. He turned back to the traders and extended his hand. $500. Take them now before sunset. The fat man pulled a leather pouch from his coat and counted out the bills on Thornhill's desk. $500 in Confederate scrip that was barely worth the paper it was printed on. But that might be enough to hold off the creditors for another month. Thornhill took the money without counting it, folded it into his pocket, and walked out of the study without looking at the children in the yard. Sarah broke free from the men holding her and ran to the children. She grabbed the youngest, the 3-year-old boy, and clutched him to her chest. You can't take him. You can't take any of them. Please, please, God, please. Briggs stepped forward, his face impassive, and pried the child from her arms. The boy screamed, reaching for his mother, his small voice calling Mama, Mama over and over, until the word lost meaning and became just sound, just pain given voice. Sarah fell to her knees in the dirt, her hands clawing at the ground, her body shaking with sobs that came from a place deeper than grief, from the place where hope dies and rage is born. The traders loaded the children into a wagon. They worked quickly, efficiently, binding their hands more securely, covering the wagon bed with a tarp to hide its cargo from any curious eyes on the road. The oldest girl, 13-year-old Ruth, looked back at Sarah one last time before the tarp fell. Her face was dry, her jaw set. She did not cry. She would never cry again for as long as she lived. As the wagon rolled out of the plantation yard, the sun was setting, turning the sky the color of old blood. Christmas Day, 1865, the day freedom became law, and the day Samuel Thornhill sold 10 children into slavery anyway, because the law meant nothing in places where power was the only truth that mattered. He stood on his porch and watched the wagon disappear down the tree-lined drive, and he told himself that he had done what was necessary, that survival required hard choices, that God would forgive him because God understood the burden of men who were born to rule and reduced to ruin. But that night, something else would come for Samuel Thornhill, something that would not forgive, that would not understand, that would hold him accountable in ways the law never could. Because in the quarters, in the space where Sarah knelt in the dirt and screamed until her voice failed, the women who had watched began to gather. They did not speak at first. They simply stood in a circle around her, their presence a wall of shared fury, shared pain, shared determination. And in that circle, in the darkness of Christmas night, they began to plan. The night descended over Thornhill Plantation like a shroud, thick and suffocating. The temperature dropped sharply as the last traces of daylight bled from the horizon, replaced by a darkness that seemed to press against the windows of the manor house. Inside, Samuel Thornhill sat alone in his study, the $500 spread across his desk like an accusation. He had counted it 3 times, as if repetition could transform the worthless Confederate scrip into something of actual value, something that could justify what he had done. But the numbers remained the same, and so did the hollow feeling in his chest that he refused to name as guilt. He poured himself a glass of whiskey from the decanter he kept hidden in his desk drawer, the good stuff, saved from before the war, when there had been money for luxuries. The liquid burned going down, but it did not warm him. Nothing seemed to warm him anymore. The house was cold despite the fire crackling in the hearth. The walls seemed to lean in, closing around him like a coffin. He told himself it was just the weather, just the draft that came through the old windows, just the settling of a house that had stood for 70 years and would stand for 70 more. But he could hear them outside. The voices from the quarters, low and rhythmic, rising and falling like a song or a prayer. He had heard that sound before, on other nights when the enslaved people gathered to mourn their dead or celebrate their secret joys, their private resistances. Usually, he ignored it, let them have their small comforts. But tonight the sound seemed different. Tonight it felt like a threat. In the quarters, Sarah had stopped screaming. Her voice was gone, reduced to a raw whisper that scraped like broken glass in her throat. But her silence was more terrifying than her screams had been, because in that silence something had hardened. She sat in the center of the circle of women, her eyes fixed on nothing. Her hands clenched into fists so tight that her nails drew blood from her palms. Around her, 15 women stood or knelt, their faces lit by the flickering light of a single lantern. They were the mothers, the grandmothers, the aunts and sisters who had survived everything the plantation had thrown at them. They had buried children, endured whippings, lived through starvation and disease and the daily violence of bondage. But this sale of children on the day freedom became law, this was a breaking point. "We can't let this stand," said Esther, the oldest woman in the quarters. She was 63, her hair white as cotton, her back bent from decades of field work. But her voice was strong, clear, carrying the authority of someone who had seen generations rise and fall. "If we let him do this, if we let him sell our babies like it's still 1860, then freedom means nothing. We're still slaves, just with different names." "What can we do?" asked Mary, a woman in her 40s who had lost 3 children to previous sales. Her voice was thick with despair. "He's got the law on his side, or thinks he does. He's got guns, he's got Briggs and the other men who will do whatever he says. We're not just anything anymore," Sarah said, her whisper cutting through the conversation like a knife. Every head turned toward her. "The war's over, we're free. The president said so. The Constitution says so. And if the law won't protect our children, then we'll protect them ourselves." "How?" Mary pressed. "The wagon's gone. They could be 20 miles away by now. We don't even know which direction they went." "North," said Ruth's mother, a woman named Hannah who had been silent until now. "I saw them turn north on the main road. They're heading toward Augusta, probably. That's where the traders have their holding pens before they move people further south or west." "Then we go north," Sarah said, standing on shaking legs. "We go tonight. We follow them. We find our children, and we bring them back." "And then what?" Esther asked, her voice gentle but firm. "Say we find them. Say we get them away from the traders. Where do we go? Thornhill won't let us stay here, not after we steal back what he thinks he sold. The other planters will hunt us. The patrollers are still out there, war or no war." "Then we don't come back," Sarah said. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. "We take the children and we go somewhere else, somewhere the old rules don't reach. The Union Army's got camps for freed people." The Freedmen's Bureau is setting up offices in the cities. We go there, we start over." The women looked at each other, fear and hope warring in their faces. It was one thing to dream of freedom in the abstract, another thing entirely to seize it with both hands and run. The world beyond the plantation was vast and unknown, full of dangers they could only imagine, but staying meant accepting that nothing had changed, that their children could still be bought and sold, that freedom was just a word white men used when it was convenient and ignored when it was not. "I'm going," Sarah said. "Tonight. Alone if I have to. But I'm going." One by one, the other women nodded. Hannah first, then Mary, then 3 younger women who had children among those sold. Esther looked at them all, then sighed and nodded too. "Then we all go. We leave tonight. Soon as the moon rises high enough to see by, we take what we can carry and nothing more. And we move fast because once Thornhill realizes we're gone, he'll come after us." "Let him come," Sarah said, and there was something in her voice that had never been there before, something cold and final, like a door closing forever. Let him try. But Sarah had other plans before they left. Plans that involved the manor house, the man inside it, and a reckoning that had been building for 32 years. She stood and walked away from the circle, moving toward her cabin. The other women watched her go, uncertain, but they did not follow. They understood that some things a person had to do alone. Inside her cabin, Sarah knelt beside the loose floorboard where she kept her secret things. A few coins she had managed to save, a lock of hair from each of her children, a small wooden doll her mother had carved for her before she was sold away, and beneath these, wrapped in oilcloth, a straight razor she had stolen from the manor house 5 years ago. She had kept it sharp, honing it against a leather strop on nights when she could not sleep, when the rage inside her needed an outlet that did not involve screaming or breaking things that would get her killed. She had never used it on anyone. She had told herself she was saving it for the day she would be free, the day she could cut her own hair short and walk away from this place without looking back. But tonight, the razor had a different purpose. Tonight, it was an instrument of justice in a world where the law had failed, where the promises of freedom rang hollow, where a man could sell children on Christmas Day and face no earthly consequence. Sarah unwrapped the razor, tested its edge against her thumb, and felt the keen bite of perfectly sharpened steel. Then she tucked it into the pocket of her dress and walked toward the manor house. The house was dark except for the light in Thornhill's study. Sarah moved through the shadows like a ghost, her feet silent on the gravel path, her breath steady despite the hammering of her heart. She had walked this path 10,000 times, carrying laundry or food or messages, always invisible, always beneath notice. The enslaved were like furniture to people like Thornhill, present but not seen, useful but not quite human. That invisibility had been a curse for 32 years. Tonight, it was a weapon. She reached the back door of the manor, the one the house servants used, and found it unlocked. Briggs was supposed to secure the house at night, but he had been drinking. She could smell the whiskey from the overseer's cabin, and he had gotten sloppy. Or perhaps he simply could not imagine that any of the enslaved people would dare enter the manor uninvited, dare cross the threshold that separated master from slave, dare challenge the order of things that had stood for generations. Sarah stepped inside. The kitchen was empty. The fire in the hearth burned down to coals. She moved through it silently, past the servants' stairs, down the hallway toward the study. She could hear Thornhill inside, muttering to himself, the clink of glass against glass as he poured another drink. She paused outside the door, her hand on the razor in her pocket, and for just a moment she hesitated. This was the moment, the choice. She could turn back, return to the quarters, leave with the other women and never look back. She could choose survival over vengeance, future over past. That was what the preachers always said. Turn the other cheek, forgive your enemies, trust in God's justice, because earthly justice was not for people like her. She had heard those sermons 1,000 times, delivered by white ministers who used the Bible to justify slavery, by black preachers who urged patience and faith because resistance meant death. But Sarah was done with patience, done with faith in a justice that never came. Her children were gone, sold into a bondage that was supposed to be over, and the man who had done it sat in his study drinking whiskey as if he had done nothing worse than sell a horse or a plough. And in that moment, Sarah understood something fundamental about the world, that systems of power perpetuated themselves not through laws or guns alone, but through the willingness of the powerless to accept their powerlessness. Every time she had bowed her head, every time she had said, "Yes, Master," and swallowed her rage, Every time she had survived by making herself small, those moments had not been wisdom or strength. They had been collaboration with her own oppression. Not tonight. Tonight, she chose rage. Tonight, she chose to become the consequence that men like Thornhill never expected, because they had built a world where consequences only flowed downward, only affected the powerless, only punished those who had nothing left to lose. Sarah pushed open the door to the study. Thornhill looked up from his desk, his face flushed with whiskey, his eyes bleary and unfocused. For a moment, he did not recognize her. She was just another black face, interchangeable with all the others. Then his brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded, his voice slurred, but still carrying the automatic authority of a lifetime of commanding slaves. "Get out. This area is off limits to—" "Where are my children?" Sarah asked. Her voice was steady, quiet, but it cut through his words like the razor in her pocket would cut through flesh. Thornhill blinked, trying to focus. "Your children? You mean the ones I sold? They're gone. That's not your concern anymore. Now get out before I have Briggs. You sold them on Christmas Day," Sarah continued, taking a step into the room. "The day freedom became law, the day slavery ended. But you sold them anyway." "I did what I had to do," Thornhill said, anger replacing confusion in his voice. He stood up, swaying slightly, and pointed toward the door. "This plantation is my property. Those children were my property. I had every right to—" "They were never your property," Sarah said, her voice rising now, the rage breaking through the control she had maintained for so long. "They were human beings, my children, and you sold them like cattle because you needed money to pay your debts, to keep living in this house, to pretend the world hasn't changed. But it has changed, and tonight, you're going to understand exactly how much." Thornhill's hand moved toward the desk drawer where he kept a pistol, but he was drunk and slow, and Sarah was neither. She crossed the distance between them in 3 quick steps, pulled the razor from her pocket, and pressed it against his throat before he could reach the weapon. The cold steel against his skin sobered him instantly, his eyes going wide with fear and comprehension. "Please," he whispered, all authority drained from his voice. "Please don't. I have money. I'll give you money. You'll what?" Sarah asked, her face inches from his. "You'll buy back my children? You'll undo what you did? You'll give me back the 32 years you stole from me? The 3 children you sold before these 10, the life I should have lived? You'll do that?" Thornhill's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He had no answer because there was no answer. Some things, once broken, could not be fixed. Some debts could never be repaid. Sarah held the razor against his throat for a long moment, feeling the rapid flutter of his pulse beneath the blade, feeling the power of life and death in her hand. It would be so easy. One quick motion, and he would bleed out on the floor of his study, surrounded by the symbols of a dying world. And part of her, the part that had been screaming since dawn, since the moment Briggs came with his rope and his list, wanted that, wanted to watch him die, wanted to be the last thing he saw, wanted him to know that he had not gotten away with it after all. But another part of her, the part that had kept 10 children alive through hell, the part that had planned and protected and endured, knew that killing him would accomplish nothing. It would not bring her children back. It would not make her free. It would only make her a murderer, give the law an excuse to hunt her down, to hang her in a public square as an example to any other enslaved person who dared to raise their hand against a white man. And she could not let that happen, not when her children were still out there, not when there was still a chance to save them. So instead of cutting, Sarah leaned in close and whispered in Thornhill's ear, "I want you to live. I want you to live with what you've done. I want you to wake up every morning knowing that somewhere out there, I'm free and you're still trapped in this dying world. I want you to wonder every night if tonight is the night I come back. I want you to spend the rest of your miserable life afraid, the way you made us afraid for generations. That's my justice." She pulled the razor away from his throat and stepped back. Thornhill collapsed into his chair, his hand going to his neck, checking for blood, even though she had not cut him. He looked at her with something like horror, as if he was seeing her, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as property, not as a servant, but as a human being with agency, will, and the power to choose mercy or vengeance. "The war's over, Thornhill," Sarah said, tucking the razor back into her pocket. "You lost, and tonight so did I. But tomorrow I'm going to find my children and take them somewhere you can never reach. And you're going to stay here in this empty house with your worthless money and your worthless pride, and you're going to rot." She turned and walked out of the study, leaving him frozen in his chair, too shocked to move, too frightened to call for help. She walked back through the manor, out the kitchen door, across the yard to the quarters where the women were waiting. The moon had risen, full and bright, casting everything in silver light. It was time to go. "Did you—" Hannah started to ask, but Sarah shook her head. "No, but he knows. He knows we're leaving, and he knows why, and he knows he can't stop us. Now let's move. We've got children to find." The women gathered their meager belongings: blankets, food, water, the few possessions they could not bear to leave behind. 15 women, ranging in age from 19 to 63, stepping off the plantation that had held them in bondage, walking into a night that held uncertainty and danger, but also, for the first time in their lives, possibility. They moved north, following the road the wagon had taken, guided by moonlight and determination, and a love that was stronger than any law, any threat, any power that sought to keep them in chains. Behind them, in the manor house, Samuel Thornhill sat in his study and began to understand what he had unleashed. Not violence, though he had feared that. Something worse. The knowledge that he was now irrelevant, that history had moved on without him, that the people he had owned had become people who could walk away, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. He poured another glass of whiskey with shaking hands and stared into the fire, and for the first time in his 47 years, Samuel Thornhill felt truly afraid. The road stretched north through pine forests and abandoned fields, a ribbon of packed dirt that turned to mud where winter rains had pooled and frozen in the ruts left by wagon wheels. The women moved in a tight group, their breath forming clouds in the cold December air, their footsteps nearly silent despite their haste. They had divided into scouts and guards, the younger women ranging ahead to watch for threats, the older women staying with the center group, protecting what little they carried. Sarah walked at the front, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her mind calculating distances and possibilities. They had perhaps 6 hours before Thornhill would realize they were gone, maybe less, if he recovered from his shock and sent Briggs to check the quarters. Once the alarm was raised, the patrollers would be mobilized. White men on horseback with dogs and guns, the same men who had hunted runaway slaves before the war and who still prowled the back roads looking for any excuse to reassert the old order. The law might say slavery was over, but these men had not received that message, or if they had chosen to ignore it. For them, any black person moving without permission was still a criminal, still property trying to escape. But Sarah had advantages they did not expect. She knew these roads, had traveled them on errands for Thornhill, delivering messages to neighboring plantations or accompanying him to town when he needed someone to carry packages. She knew which paths led to Union Army camps, which towns had Freedmen's Bureau offices, which churches hid sympathetic ministers who would help escape slaves. Freed people, she corrected herself, though the distinction felt fragile in the dark. And she knew that the traders would not move quickly. They would stop for the night, rest the horses, maybe camp in one of the abandoned barns that dotted the countryside. They were confident, arrogant even, believing themselves untouchable because they always had been. That arrogance would be their weakness, and Sarah intended to exploit it. 2 miles north of the plantation, the women came to a fork in the road. The main path continued straight toward Augusta, 40 miles distant. The smaller path branched east toward a settlement called Freedman's Creek, a cluster of cabins and small farms where formerly enslaved people had begun to build their own community in the chaotic months since the war's end. Hannah, who had been there once before, said there might be help there, people who would join them or at least provide information about which way the traders had gone. "We split up," Sarah said, her voice low but firm. "Half of us go to Freedman's Creek, get help, spread the word. The other half keep following the main road, track the wagon. We meet back here at dawn, share what we learned, decide what to do next." Esther shook her head. "Splitting up is dangerous. If the patrollers find us, if we stay together, we're slower, more visible," Sarah interrupted. "And we need more people. 10 children in a wagon with 3 armed men. We can't take them by ourselves. We need numbers. We need allies. We need people who understand what's at stake." The women debated in hushed voices, aware that every minute they stood still was a minute wasted. Finally they agreed. Hannah would lead 7 women to Freedman's Creek. Sarah would lead the other 7 north on the main road, tracking the wagon. They would reunite at dawn at the fork, pooling their resources and information. It was not a perfect plan, but it was a plan. And planning itself was an act of resistance, a declaration that they were not helpless, not victims, but agents of their own liberation. The 2 groups separated, moving in opposite directions into the night. Sarah's group followed the main road, moving quickly but carefully, staying to the shadows when possible, ready to dive into the woods if they heard hoofbeats or voices. The moon provided enough light to see by, but it also made them visible to anyone else who might be watching. They passed abandoned houses, their windows dark and empty, testaments to families who had fled the war or lost everything in its aftermath. They passed fields where cotton had once grown in endless rows, now overgrown with weeds and scrub pine. The landscape was a graveyard of the Old South, and they were walking through it towards something new, something undefined, something that existed more as possibility than reality. 3 miles from the fork, they found the first sign, fresh wagon tracks leading off the main road onto a smaller path that disappeared into a stand of oak trees. Sarah knelt and examined the tracks in the moonlight, running her fingers over the deep impressions left by wheels carrying a heavy load. The tracks were recent, no more than a few hours old. The wagon had turned here, seeking concealment or perhaps heading toward a specific destination the traders knew about. "This is them," Sarah whispered. The other women gathered around her, their faces tense. "They went into the woods. There might be a clearing ahead, a place they use regularly. We need to scout it carefully before we do anything." They left the road and followed the wagon tracks into the forest. The trees closed in around them, blocking the moonlight, turning the world into a maze of shadows and half-seen shapes. They moved slowly now, feeling their way forward, every snapped twig and rustled leaf sounding impossibly loud in the silence. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, but her hands were steady. She had the razor in her pocket, and 2 of the other women carried knives they had taken from the plantation kitchen. They were not warriors, but they were mothers, and that made them dangerous in ways men who trafficked in human flesh never anticipated. After 10 minutes of careful progress, they saw light ahead, the flicker of a campfire through the trees. Sarah held up her hand, stopping the group. They crouched in the underbrush, barely breathing, and watched. There, in a small clearing, stood the wagon. The tarp had been removed, revealing the empty bed where the children had been confined. Near the wagon, a fire burned, and around it sat 3 men. The fat trader with tobacco-stained teeth, the thin, sharp-faced one, and a third man they had not seen before, younger and armed with a rifle that leaned against a log within easy reach. But the children were not in the wagon. Sarah's chest tightened with panic until she saw the small cabin at the edge of the clearing, little more than a shack, really, with gaps in the walls and a roof that sagged in the middle. Light showed through the gaps and she could hear faint sounds from inside. Children's voices, muffled and frightened. They had been locked inside while the men made camp for the night. If you've been moved by Sarah's courage and determination, hit that like button and subscribe. We're about to witness one of the most dramatic confrontations in this story. Don't miss what happens next. Drop a comment letting us know what you think Sarah should do. Sarah studied the scene, her mind working through possibilities. 3 armed men against 7 unarmed women. The element of surprise might let them get close, but then what? A fight would put the children in danger, might result in many someones getting killed, but they could not simply walk away, could not leave the children locked in that cabin while the traders slept, and planned to move them further south at dawn, further from reach, further from hope. "We wait," Sarah whispered to the women crouched beside her. "Wait until they sleep. Then we move." "And if they have guards posted?" one of the younger women asked. "If one of them stays awake, then we adapt," Sarah said. "But right now, we watch and we learn. We figure out their patterns, their weaknesses, and when the moment comes, we strike fast and we strike hard." They settled into the underbrush, watching the camp, waiting for the men to finish their meal and bank the fire and settle into sleep. It was agonizing. Every minute felt like an hour, every sound the children made inside the cabin a knife in Sarah's heart. But she forced herself to be patient. Patience had kept her alive for 32 years. Tonight, it would set her children free. The traders talked among themselves, their voices carrying across the clearing. Sarah listened, gathering information. The fat man complained about the rough roads and the cold weather. The thin man counted money, dividing it into shares, arguing about percentages. The young one cleaned his rifle, methodical and thorough, clearly the muscle of the operation. They talked about their plans. They would move at dawn, head further south to a holding facility near Macon where they had connections. People who would take the children and place them with families, a euphemism for selling them into apprenticeships that were slavery in all but name. The thin man laughed about how easy it had been, how Thornhill had practically begged them to take the children off his hands, how there were dozens of planters in the same situation, desperate for cash and willing to ignore the new laws. "Reconstruction won't last," the fat man said, spitting tobacco juice into the fire. "Yankees will get tired of babysitting the coloreds, Pack up and go home, and then things'll go back to how they were. Maybe not exactly the same, but close enough. These people need masters. They don't know how to be free." Sarah's hand tightened on the razor in her pocket. She wanted to stand up, to scream at them, to show them exactly how wrong they were. But she stayed silent, stayed hidden, because rage without strategy was just martyrdom, and she had not come this far to die in a nameless clearing while her children watched. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes, the men began to settle for the night. The fat man and the thin man rolled themselves in blankets near the fire. The young one took first watch, sitting with his back against a tree, his rifle across his lap. He would stay awake for a few hours, then wake one of the others to take over. Standard procedure for men who knew they were in dangerous territory, transporting valuable— Sarah's mind rebelled against the word cargo. But the young guard had made a mistake. He had positioned himself facing the wagon and the cabin, watching for external threats or escape attempts. He had not considered that the threat might come from behind. From the forest he assumed was empty. Men like him never did. They were so used to being the hunters that they forgot what it felt like to be prey. Sarah waited another 30 minutes, watching the guard's posture, timing his alertness. She could see him fighting sleep, his head nodding forward, then jerking back up, his eyes struggling to stay open. The fire burned low, casting more shadows than light. This was the moment, the brief window between wakefulness and sleep, between vigilance and vulnerability. She turned to the women beside her and mouthed instructions, using hand signals they had developed in the quarters over years of communicating silently under the eyes of overseers. 3 women would circle left, approaching the cabin from the side. 3 would circle right, positioning themselves near the wagon. Sarah would approach the guard directly, using the darkness and his fatigue to get close before he realized she was there. If everything went according to plan, they would have the children out of the cabin and into the woods before the traders fully woke. If it did not go according to plan, well, they would deal with that when it happened. The women separated, moving through the forest like ghosts, using every skill they had learned from a lifetime of making themselves invisible. Sarah moved forward, keeping low, placing each foot carefully to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. The guard was 20 feet away, then 15, then 10. His head nodded forward again, and this time it stayed down longer. His breathing deepened. He was not asleep, not quite, but he was close. Sarah was 5 feet away when his head jerked up. His eyes opened, unfocused, searching the darkness. For a moment she froze, certain he had seen her, certain everything was about to go wrong, but his gaze slid past her, not recognizing the dark shape in the shadows as human, just another part of the forest. He yawned, shifted the rifle in his lap, and let his eyes drift closed again. Sarah moved. 3 quick steps brought her behind him. She wrapped one arm around his throat, cutting off his air and his ability to cry out, while her other hand pressed the razor against his neck. Not cutting, just threatening, making the message clear. The guard's eyes flew open, his hands coming up to grab her arm, but she tightened her grip and hissed in his ear, "Don't move, don't make a sound, or I swear to God I will open your throat right here." The guard froze. He was young, maybe 19 or 20, and up close Sarah could see the fear in his eyes. Good. Let him be afraid. Let him understand for just one moment what it felt like to be powerless, to have his life held in someone else's hands, to know that mercy was a choice someone else would make. "Drop the rifle," Sarah whispered. "Slowly." The guard complied, his hands shaking as he lowered the weapon to the ground. One of the other women darted forward and grabbed it, checking to make sure it was loaded before pointing it at the 2 men sleeping by the fire. They had not woken. The night remained still, except for the pounding of Sarah's heart and the ragged breathing of the guard in her arms. "Now," Sarah said, her voice cold and hard, "you're going to unlock that cabin and get those children out, and you're going to do it quietly, without waking your friends. Because if anything goes wrong, if anyone gets hurt, you'll be the first to die, understand?" The guard nodded frantically. Sarah released her grip slightly, enough to let him breathe, but not enough to let him think about resisting. She pulled him to his feet, keeping the razor pressed against his neck, and marched him toward the cabin. The other women moved into position surrounding the sleeping traders, ready to act if either man stirred. At the cabin door, the guard fumbled with a key ring, his hands shaking so badly he dropped it twice before managing to unlock the padlock. The door swung open, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There they were, all 10 children, huddled together on the dirt floor, their faces streaked with tears and dirt, their eyes wide with fear and confusion, and when they saw Sarah, hope. Her youngest, the 3-year-old boy, was asleep in the arms of Ruth, the 13-year-old girl who had raised him like her own brother. Ruth looked up at Sarah, and for the first time since the wagon had left the plantation, tears began to stream down her face. "Mama," she whispered. "Mama, you came." "Of course I came," Sarah said, her own voice breaking. "Did you think I wouldn't? Now come on, all of you, quickly and quietly. We're going home." The children stumbled out of the cabin, moving towards Sarah and the other women with a desperate urgency. The women embraced them, checked them for injuries, wrapped them in blankets they had carried from the plantation. Everyone was crying now, silent tears of relief and joy and residual terror, but they kept moving, kept gathering the children, kept preparing to disappear into the forest before the traders woke and discovered their cargo had vanished. Sarah was about to release the guard, to let him collapse on the ground while they fled, when she heard it, the distinctive click of a gun being cocked. She turned, and there stood the thin trader, his pistol aimed directly at her chest. He must have been a lighter sleeper than she thought, or perhaps the sound of the cabin door opening had woken him. It did not matter. What mattered was the gun, and the smile on his face, and the certainty in his voice when he spoke. "Well now," he said, loud enough to wake the fat man who began to stir by the fire. "Looks like we got ourselves some runaways, and you know what we do with runaways, don't you?" Time seemed to stop. Sarah stood frozen, the razor still at the young guard's throat, but her eyes locked on the pistol aimed at her heart. The thin trader's smile widened, showing teeth like a predator who had just cornered his prey. Behind him, the fat man scrambled to his feet, reaching for his own weapon. The children whimpered, pressing against the women who held them, and Sarah felt the entire moment balanced on the edge of a knife. One wrong move and everything would collapse into violence and death. "Let him go," the thin trader said, gesturing with his pistol toward the young guard. "Let him go, and maybe I won't shoot you where you stand. Maybe." Sarah's mind raced. She could kill the guard, one quick slash, and he would bleed out in seconds, but that would not stop the bullet, would not save the children, would not prevent the other traders from gunning down everyone in the clearing. She could try to use him as a shield, but the thin trader did not look like the kind of man who cared whether his partner lived or died. These men dealt in human commodities. They understood cost-benefit analysis. One young guard was an acceptable loss if it meant maintaining control. Death was not a threat to someone who had already decided that some things were worth dying for. And in that realization, Sarah found a kind of power that transcended the gun pointed at her chest. "You're not going to shoot me," Sarah said, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "You're not going to shoot any of us." The thin trader's smile faltered. "And why is that?" "Because you're a businessman," Sarah said, slowly lowering the razor from the guard's throat but keeping her grip on his arm. "And dead merchandise doesn't make you any money. You've got 10 children here worth— What did Thornhill pay you? $500? That's $50 per child. But if you kill us, if you kill these women, you're going to have 10 traumatized children who won't stop screaming, won't cooperate, won't be worth half what you paid for them. And more than that, you're going to have bodies. Bodies create problems, bodies attract attention, bodies bring Union soldiers and Freedmen's Bureau agents, and questions you don't want to answer." The thin trader's gun hand wavered slightly. Sarah pressed her advantage, taking a small step forward, her voice growing stronger. "But here's what I'm offering you. We take the children and walk away. Right now, you let us go, you pack up your camp, and you ride back to Thornhill and tell him the merchandise escaped. You keep his $500, I'm sure you haven't spent all of it yet, and you chalk it up to the chaos of these new times. Reconstruction, freedom, all these inconvenient laws that make your business harder. You take the loss and you move on to your next deal, because that's what businessmen do, right? They cut their losses. Or," the thin trader said, his voice hardening, "I shoot you right now as an example. I shoot 1 or 2 of your friends. I put the fear of God into these children so they never think about running again. And then I take them south anyway. Sell them for more money because now they're properly broken. That's also what businessmen do. They protect their investments." The fat man had his gun out now too, moving to flank Sarah and the women. The clearing had become a standoff. Everyone armed or holding children. Everyone calculating odds and outcomes. The night was silent except for breathing and the crackling of the dying fire, and Sarah realized that words alone would not be enough. She needed leverage, needed something that would tip the balance, needed— The shot rang out from the forest, loud and sharp, echoing through the trees. Everyone flinched, spinning toward the sound. Then another shot, and another, and suddenly there were voices shouting, figures moving through the darkness. the thunder of multiple people crashing through the underbrush. The thin trader's attention split between Sarah and the new threat, his gun swinging wildly between targets. The fat man fired blindly into the forest and someone screamed, not in pain but in rage and defiance. Hannah burst into the clearing, leading not 7 women but nearly 30 people, men and women from Freedman's Creek, armed with hunting rifles and farming tools and the kind of desperate courage that comes from finally having something to protect. They spread out, surrounding the clearing, surrounding the traders, their weapons trained on the 3 men who suddenly found themselves outnumbered 10 to 1. "Drop your weapons," Hannah commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 6 months building a free community and would not tolerate any threat to it. "Drop them now, or we will drop you." The thin trader looked around, calculating. He was smart enough to see that the situation had shifted irrevocably. 3 men with pistols against 30 armed and angry freed people was not a fight he could win. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his gun. The fat man did the same, cursing under his breath. The young guard, still held by Sarah, made no move at all. He was shaking so badly he probably could not have fought if he wanted to. "Good choice," Hannah said. She gestured to several of the men from Freedman's Creek, who moved forward to collect the traders' weapons. "Now here's what's going to happen. You 3 are going to get on that wagon, and you're going to ride back wherever you came from. And you're going to tell everyone you meet that the old days are over, that you can't buy and sell people anymore, not in these parts. That if you try, you'll answer to us." "You can't do this," the fat man sputtered. "This is theft. We paid good money. You paid money for human beings," one of the men from Freedman's Creek interrupted. He was tall and powerfully built, with scars on his back that told their own story. "Human beings who are free by law, that makes you kidnappers and slavers. And if we wanted, we could string you up right here, and the law would probably thank us for it. So you've got 2 choices. Take our mercy and leave, or take our justice and die. What's it going to be?" The traders chose mercy. They stumbled toward their wagon, moving quickly, clearly terrified of the people surrounding them. The thin trader paused as he climbed onto the driver's seat, looking back at Sarah with something like respect mixed with hatred. "This isn't over," he said. "There are more like us, plenty more, and not all of them will let you walk away." "Then they'll learn the same lesson you did tonight," Sarah replied. "That we're not property anymore, that we'll fight for our freedom and our children, and that we're not alone." The wagon rolled out of the clearing, disappearing down the path toward the main road. The people from Freedman's Creek watched until it was gone, their weapons still ready, their vigilance undiminished. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely did they lower their guns and turn their attention to the women and children they had just saved. Hannah crossed to Sarah and embraced her, both women shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. "When we told them at Freedman's Creek what had happened," Hannah said, "they didn't even hesitate, just grabbed their guns and followed us back. Said they'd been waiting for something like this, some reason to show the traders and the patrollers that we're not victims anymore." "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "Thank you for bringing them. We couldn't have if you hadn't come when you did." "We're family now," Hannah said firmly. "All of us. That's what freedom means. We protect each other. No one gets left behind. No one's children get stolen. Not anymore." The children were gathered up, held and comforted by the women who had come to save them. Ruth clung to Sarah, her thin body racked with sobs that she had held in for hours, finally allowing herself to break now that safety had arrived. The 3-year-old slept through most of it, exhausted beyond the capacity to process what had happened. The other children stood in a dazed cluster, their eyes huge in their small faces, trying to understand that they were safe, that the nightmare was over, that they were going home, wherever home would be now. One of the men from Freedman's Creek, an older man named Moses who seemed to be a leader in their community, approached Sarah. "You and your people can't go back to that plantation," he said gently. "Not after tonight. Thornhill will call the patrollers, maybe the military. He'll say you stole his property, incited a rebellion, whatever lies he needs to tell to get you arrested or worse." "I know," Sarah said. She had known from the moment she walked into Thornhill's study that there was no going back. "Where can we go?" "Freedman's Creek," Moses said immediately. "We've got land, cabins we're building. It's not much yet, but it's ours. We're making something new there, a place where the old rules don't reach. You're welcome to join us, all of you. Your labor is your own now. You work for yourselves, keep what you earn, make your own decisions. That's what freedom is." Sarah looked at the other women from the plantation, seeing the hope and uncertainty warring in their faces. Freedman's Creek was unknown territory, a leap into an uncertain future, but the plantation was a known hell, and they had just burned every bridge that might have led them back to it. There was only forward now, only the possibility of something better than what they had left behind. "We'll come," Sarah said. "All of us. And we'll help build whatever you're building, because you're right, we're family now, and family protects each other." The group began the journey to Freedman's Creek as the first grey light of dawn touched the eastern horizon. They walked together, 40 people moving as one, the children carried by adults, the elderly supported by the young, everyone helping everyone else, because that was the only way any of them would survive. They sang as they walked, old songs from the quarters transformed into freedom songs, hymns of deliverance and hope. Their voices rose into the cold morning air, carrying across the abandoned fields and empty roads, announcing to the world that something had changed, that people who had been property had become people who would fight and sacrifice and risk everything for each other. Sarah walked near the front, Ruth beside her, the 3-year-old sleeping on her hip. She thought about Thornhill alone in his study and wondered if he was awake yet, if he had discovered the empty quarters, if he understood that his world had ended not with violence, but with exodus, with people simply refusing to play their assigned roles anymore. She thought about the thin trader and his parting threat, about all the men like him who still existed, who would continue to resist and undermine and try to resurrect the old order under new names. She thought about the long road ahead, the struggles they would face, the battles they would have to fight. But she also thought about the children sleeping peacefully now, about the community waiting for them at Freedman's Creek, about the possibility, fragile but real, of building lives that belonged to them. And in that moment, walking through the dawn with her family around her, Sarah understood something fundamental. Freedom was not a gift given by governments or guaranteed by laws. Freedom was something you seized and defended and built with your own hands, every day, against every force that sought to take it away. They reached Freedman's Creek as the sun cleared the horizon, turning the sky gold and pink. The settlement was small, maybe 20 cabins clustered around a central meeting house, with fields marked out for spring planting and a well being dug in the center of the community. But to the women and children from Thornhill's plantation, it looked like paradise, it looked like home. The people of Freedman's Creek welcomed them with food and blankets, and the kind of joy that comes from growing your community, from adding strength to strength. Children ran to greet children, and within minutes they were playing together as if they had known each other forever. The women were shown to empty cabins, given spaces that would be theirs, promised plots of land where they could grow their own food, make their own living, answer to no master but themselves. Sarah stood in the doorway of the cabin that would be hers and her children's, looking out at the community gathering in the morning light. She thought about Christmas Day, about how it had begun with the worst thing she could imagine, her children being sold, and how it had ended with something she had never dared imagine. True freedom, defended and won by people who refused to accept anything less. The old world was dying. The new world was being born in places like this, in communities of people who had been property deciding what it meant to be human, to be free, to be accountable only to each other and to the better angels of their nature. It would not be easy. There would be setbacks and tragedies, and moments when it seemed like the old world would rise again and swallow everything they had built. But Sarah had learned something crucial in the past 24 hours, that the power to create the future belonged to those who refused to accept the past. She turned back into the cabin, where Ruth was helping the younger children settle onto sleeping pallets, and she smiled. They had survived. They had fought. They had won. And tomorrow, they would begin the long work of building lives worth living. 3 months passed. Winter gave way to the tentative warmth of early spring, and Freedman's Creek transformed from a fragile experiment into something more permanent, more real. The cabins that had been hastily constructed now had proper roofs and reinforced walls. The fields had been cleared and planted with vegetables and cotton, though this time the cotton would be harvested by free hands for profit that belonged to the people who grew it. A school had been established in the meeting house, where children learned to read and write from teachers who had themselves only recently learned. And at the center of it all, Sarah and the other women from Thornhill's plantation had become integral members of the community, their courage on that Christmas night now part of the settlement's founding story. But the outside world had not forgotten them, and neither had Samuel Thornhill. The first hint of trouble came on a warm afternoon in late March, when Moses returned from a supply run to the nearest town, his face grave. He called a meeting in the central square, and everyone gathered, nearly 70 people now, as word of Freedman's Creek had spread, and more families had arrived seeking refuge and opportunity. "There's talk," Moses said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "Talk from the planters in the surrounding counties. They're angry about communities like ours. Say we're encouraging field hands to abandon their contracts, to break apprenticeship agreements. They're pressuring the local authorities to do something about it." "Let them pressure," said one of the younger men, a former field hand named Isaac who had arrived 2 weeks earlier. "We're not breaking any laws. We're free people living on land we're buying with honest work." "The law doesn't always matter when powerful men want something different," Moses replied. "I heard Thornhill's name specifically mentioned. He's been traveling to other plantations, building alliances, telling his version of what happened that Christmas night. He's calling it theft, insurrection, a threat to the social order, and he's got others believing him." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had known this moment would come, had known from the beginning that men like Thornhill would not simply accept their loss of power and privilege. But hearing his name spoken aloud, knowing he was actively working to undermine what they had built, brought back all the rage and fear from that night 3 months ago. "What does he want?" Hannah asked, her voice steady but tense. "Officially, return of stolen property, meaning you, Sarah, and the other women and children from his plantation," Moses said. "Unofficially, he wants to make an example. He wants to prove that black people can't just walk away, can't build their own communities, can't exist outside white control. He wants Freedman's Creek destroyed as a warning to everyone else who might get similar ideas." The crowd erupted in angry voices, people shouting over each other, some calling for armed resistance, others urging caution and legal channels. Sarah stood silent in the middle of the chaos, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. She had brought this threat to Freedman's Creek. Her decision to confront Thornhill, to rescue the children, to refuse to bow, it had been right, necessary, but it had also painted a target on this entire community. "It's me he wants," Sarah said loudly, cutting through the noise. The crowd fell silent, turning to look at her. "Let me go back. Let me face whatever charges he's invented. If I surrender, maybe he'll leave the rest of you alone." "Absolutely not," Ruth said immediately, stepping forward to stand beside her mother. At 13, nearly 14 now, she had grown taller and harder in the past 3 months, her eyes carrying a determination that reminded Sarah of herself. "We don't sacrifice our own. That's what they did to us for centuries. We're not doing it to each other." "Ruth's right," Moses said. "If we give in now, if we let them take even one person, we're admitting that we're still property, still subject to their rules. We might as well pack up and go back to the plantations right now." "Then what do we do?" Sarah asked. "Wait for them to come with guns and dogs? Watch them burn our homes and drag us back in chains?" "We prepare," said a woman named Esther, not the same Esther from Thornhill's plantation, but a schoolteacher who had arrived from Charleston with her 3 children. "We document everything. We contact the Freedmen's Bureau in Augusta, get them involved officially. We reach out to Union Army officers who might help. We build legal defenses and physical defenses. We make it clear that attacking us comes with consequences. And we tell our story," added Hannah. "The real story. Not Thornhill's lies about theft and insurrection, but the truth about what he did, about selling children on Christmas Day after slavery was already abolished, about violating federal law for profit. We make sure everyone knows who the real criminal is." The community began to organize. Moses and several other men rode to Augusta to meet with Freedmen's Bureau officials and file formal complaints against Thornhill. Esther began writing letters to northern newspapers, telling the story of Freedman's Creek and the threats it faced, hoping to generate political pressure. The men who had served in the Union Army, and there were several, veterans who had fought for their own freedom, and then come south to help build it, began training others in basic military discipline, preparing defenses in case talk turned to violence. And Sarah, along with Ruth and several other women, began documenting everything that had happened. They wrote down their testimonies about life on Thornhill's plantation, about the sale of the children, about the rescue, and the founding of Freedman's Creek. They collected names and dates and details, building a legal case that could be presented to any authority willing to listen. It was slow, painstaking work. Many of them were still learning to write fluently, but it was also empowering. For the first time, they were controlling their own narrative, writing their own history, instead of letting others write it for them. 6 weeks after Moses' warning, the confrontation came. But it did not come in the form anyone expected. A delegation arrived at Freedman's Creek on a bright April morning, 5 men in expensive suits, accompanied by a federal marshal, and 2 soldiers from the Union Army garrison in Augusta. The marshal carried official papers, and his face bore the uncomfortable expression of a man forced to enforce laws he did not fully understand or agree with. The community gathered to meet them, standing together in the central square, presenting a united front. Sarah stood at the front, flanked by Moses and Hannah and Esther, with Ruth and the other children behind them. She could see Thornhill among the delegation, standing slightly apart, his face thinner than she remembered, his eyes burning with barely contained rage. The marshal stepped forward and cleared his throat. "I have here warrants for the arrest of Sarah." He paused, realizing he did not have a last name, that enslaved people often had not been allowed surnames. Sarah, formerly of the Thornhill plantation, on charges of theft, assault, and inciting insurrection. Also warrants for, he consulted his papers, reading off the names of the other women who had participated in the rescue. "On whose authority?" Moses asked calmly. "On the authority of Samuel Thornhill, who has filed complaints with the county court, and on the authority of the Freedmen's Bureau, which is investigating violations of apprenticeship laws," the marshal said. He sounded unhappy about it, but he was doing his job. "I'd like to see those bureau documents," Esther said, stepping forward, "because I've been in correspondence with bureau officials in Augusta, and they assured me no such investigation was authorized." The marshal looked uncomfortable. One of the suited men, a lawyer, clearly stepped forward. "The bureau has broad authority to investigate labor disputes and enforce apprenticeship agreements. These women violated those agreements when they absconded with children who were legally bound. The children were sold," Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through the lawyer's smooth words, like her razor had cut through lies 3 months ago. "Sold on December 25, 1865, weeks after the 13th Amendment was ratified. That makes it kidnapping and human trafficking under federal law, and we have witnesses, documentation, and testimony to prove it." She nodded to Ruth, who stepped forward with a leather satchel containing all the documents they had prepared. Ruth handed it to the marshal, who opened it with obvious reluctance and began reading. His expression changed as he worked through the pages, changing from bureaucratic indifference to surprise to growing anger. "This says the sale occurred on Christmas Day," the marshal said slowly, looking up at Thornhill. "After the 13th Amendment was ratified. Is that true?" "The amendment wasn't officially certified until December 18th, the lawyer said quickly. "There was significant confusion about when it actually took effect. My client believed—" "Your client sold 10 children into slavery after slavery was constitutionally abolished," the marshal said, his voice hardening. "That's not a labor dispute. That's a federal crime." Thornhill finally spoke, his voice shaking with rage. "Those children were my property. I raised them, fed them, housed them for years. I had every right to recoup my investment. They were never your property," Sarah said, stepping forward until she was face to face with the man who had owned her for 32 years. "We were never anyone's property. We were human beings held in bondage against our will, and the moment that bondage became illegal, we became free. And you tried to steal our children and sell them back into slavery because you couldn't accept that your world was ending. Well, it has ended, and now you're going to face the consequences." The marshal looked at the Union Army soldiers, who had been standing silently observing the confrontation. They nodded almost imperceptibly. Their sympathies were clearly with the freed people, not with the former slaveholder. The marshal took a deep breath and made his decision. "Samuel Thornhill, I'm placing you under arrest for violation of the 13th Amendment, kidnapping and human trafficking," he said. "These other warrants," he crumpled the papers and dropped them in the dirt, "are void. This community is operating within the law, and anyone who attempts to interfere with it will answer to federal authority." Thornhill's face went white, then red, cycling through shock and rage and disbelief. "You can't arrest me. I'm a property owner, a taxpayer. These people are nothing. They're free citizens," the marshal interrupted. "And you're a criminal. Now you can come quietly or my soldiers can make you come. Your choice." The soldiers stepped forward, and Thornhill finally understood that the old order really was dead, that titles and property and skin color would not protect him anymore. That justice, incomplete and imperfect as it was, had finally caught up with him. He went quietly in the end, his shoulders slumped, looking suddenly like the old man he had become. As the delegation prepared to leave, escorting Thornhill back to Augusta for trial, one of the suited men approached Sarah. He was younger than the others, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who genuinely believed in the law. "I'm from the Freedmen's Bureau," he said quietly. "The real bureau, not whatever authority these frauds were claiming. I've been following your case since your letters reached our office." I want you to know that we're going to make sure Thornhill faces full prosecution, and we're going to use your community as a model, proof that freed people can build sustainable, self-governing settlements when given the support and protection they deserve." "Thank you," Sarah said, "but we don't need you to make us a model. We're just people trying to live free. That shouldn't be remarkable." The young official smiled sadly. "You're right. It shouldn't be. But in this moment, in this place, it is. And that matters. Your courage matters. Your refusal to accept injustice matters. And it's going to inspire others, is already inspiring others, to do the same." After the delegation left, the community of Freedman's Creek erupted in celebration. There was music and dancing, children running wild with joy, adults embracing and crying and laughing all at once. They had won, not completely, not forever, but for today they had won. The threat had been turned back, the oppressor had been held accountable, and their community had been validated, recognized, protected by the very federal authority that was supposed to guarantee their freedom. Sarah stood apart from the celebration, watching her children play with the other children of Freedman's Creek. Ruth noticed her mother's distance and came to stand beside her. "We did it, Mama," Ruth said softly. "We really did it. For now," Sarah replied. "But this fight isn't over. Thornhill's just one man. There are thousands like him, and they're not going to give up their power without a fight. Reconstruction won't last forever. Eventually, the federal government will pull back, and when it does, all these communities we're building will be vulnerable again. Then we'll fight again," Ruth said with the certainty of youth. "And we'll win again, because we know something they don't." "What's that?" "That freedom isn't something you can take away once people have really tasted it. You can oppress us, threaten us, try to push us back down, but you can't make us forget what it feels like to be free. And as long as we remember, as long as we keep fighting, we'll eventually win. Maybe not in our lifetime, but eventually." Sarah looked at her daughter, this fierce, brilliant girl who had survived slavery and sale and rescue, who had learned to read and write in 3 months, who spoke with the confidence of someone who truly believed the future could be different from the past, and she felt something she had rarely allowed herself to feel: hope. "You're right," Sarah said, putting her arm around Ruth's shoulders. "And that's why we have to keep telling our story, why we have to document everything, teach our children, build institutions that will outlast us. Because this," she gestured at Freedman's Creek, at the celebration, at the community they had built from nothing, "this is just the beginning. We're planting seeds that will grow for generations." As the sun set over Freedman's Creek that evening, turning the sky orange and purple and gold, Sarah thought about Christmas Day 3 months ago. She thought about the worst moment of her life transforming into the catalyst for the best thing she had ever done. She thought about Samuel Thornhill sitting in a jail cell in Augusta, facing trial for crimes he never imagined he could be held accountable for. She thought about the long road ahead, the battles still to be fought, the setbacks and heartbreaks that would inevitably come. But mostly, she thought about her children sleeping safely in their cabin, about the community of free people surrounding her, about the possibility, fragile but real, of building a world where no mother would ever again have to watch her children be sold, where no person would ever again be treated as property, where freedom meant something more than just the absence of chains. The old world had died on Christmas Day, 1865, when Samuel Thornhill sold 10 children into slavery and thought he could get away with it. The new world had been born that same night, when Sarah and the other women refused to accept their powerlessness, when they chose courage over safety, when they decided that some things were worth any risk, any sacrifice. And now, 3 months later, that new world was taking root in places like Freedman's Creek. It was fragile. It was threatened. It would require constant vigilance and sacrifice to protect, but it was real, and it was theirs. Sarah walked back to her cabin as the stars began to appear, brilliant against the darkening sky. Tomorrow, there would be work to do, fields to plant, children to teach, legal documents to prepare, defenses to maintain. Tomorrow, the long struggle for true equality and justice would continue, as it would continue for generations to come. But tonight, Sarah allowed herself to rest. Tonight, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what they had accomplished. Tonight, she allowed herself to believe that freedom was not just a word or a promise, but a reality they were building together, one day at a time, one courageous choice at a time. And somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, not the bells of oppression and empty piety, but the bells of liberation, calling people to witness the birth of something new, something precious, something worth fighting for, a community of free people, building their own destiny, writing their own story, refusing to let anyone ever again tell them who they were or what they were worth. The master had sold 10 slave children on Christmas Day, 1865, and what happened to him that night, what happened in the months that followed, was justice. Not perfect justice, not complete justice, but real justice nonetheless. The kind of justice that comes when people refuse to accept injustice, when they organize and resist and build alternatives, when they hold the powerful accountable and create systems where freedom means more than just a word on paper. Samuel Thornhill would be tried, convicted, and imprisoned for his crimes. His plantation would be seized and subdivided, sold to freed people who would work the land for themselves. His name would become synonymous, not with power and prestige, but with the dying gasps of an evil system that had finally been defeated. And Freedman's Creek would thrive, would grow, would become one of dozens of such communities across the South, where formerly enslaved people built new lives, new institutions, new possibilities. The story was not over. The struggle would continue for decades, for centuries, but on this night in this place, the people of Freedman's Creek had proven something essential, that freedom was not given, it was taken, that justice was not guaranteed, it was fought for, and that the courage of ordinary people, mothers protecting their children, communities protecting their members, individuals refusing to accept the unacceptable, could change the world. Sarah closed the door of her cabin and listened to the sound of her children breathing in their sleep, and she smiled because they were free, and no one would ever take that away from them again. And tell us in the comments, what moment from Sarah's story inspired you the most? We'd love to hear your thoughts.